In 1998, a famous spiritual guru and cult leader perished, and days later his devoted disciples vanished without a trace. Taisha Abelar and four other women from the same unusual cult went missing along with her. Decades later, the fate of Taisha and her companions remains one of California's most haunting, obscure, unsolved mysteries. Taisha Abelar was born Mary Ann Simcoe and was an American anthropologist and author, and one of the closest disciples of Carlos Castaneda. Castaneda was a New Age guru and best-selling writer whose tales of a Yaqui shaman named Don Juan fascinated millions in the 1970s. Notably, these stories of this so-called real shaman are now suspected to have been faked, with Castaneda himself using this fictional character as the basis for his New Age movement. He was also an anthropology professor at UCLA, which gave him access to young women who he could recruit into his budding cult. In the early 1970s, as a student at UCLA, Abelar met Castaneda and soon joined his inner circle of female followers, a group he called the Witches. She embraced Castaneda's philosophy of erasing personal history. She changed her name, cut off contact with her family, and shrouded her life in secrecy. Abelar lived at Castaneda's Los Angeles compound and devoted herself entirely to his quote-unquote mystical teachings. Shockingly, like all the other members of his all-female inner circle, she was also romantically involved with the guru. Carlos Castaneda died on April 27, 1998, from liver cancer. Castaneda had taught that he was an enlightened sorcerer who could leave this world in a truly miraculous way. His followers believed this wholeheartedly, but he perished in a mundane way and was quietly cremated. Just days after his passing, Taisha Abelar gathered up the four other closest associates of Castaneda. These women were Florinda Donner, Amalia Marquez, Kylie Lundahl, and Patricia Parton, all of these names being the alternative identities they had adopted as part of the group. They left behind no public announcements or goodbyes, having already severed ties with outsiders long before. At first, few even noticed they were gone, since the group's secretive lifestyle meant there were no immediate reports. Only months later did the peculiar truth emerge. The women known as Castaneda's witches had all slipped away after his passing. For several years, no trace of Taisha Abelar or the others turned up. Some believed that they had gone to Mexico and posted up near where Castaneda's cremated remains had been released. After all, they were crazy cultists, and cultists are necessarily going to do weird and unusual things. Then in 2003, hikers in Death Valley National Park came upon human skeletal remains bleached by the desert sun. The remains were eventually identified as Patricia Parton, one of the 5 missing women and Castaneda's longtime disciple, whom he had nicknamed his, quote, Blue Scout. Parton's car was reportedly found abandoned near a remote sand dune, not far from where her bones lay. This grim discovery intensified fears about the fate of Abelar and the others. Despite extensive wilderness searches, no evidence of the other 4 women was found in the area. Parton's death in the desert raised more questions than answers. An investigation suggested she may have died from dehydration or exposure, but there were puzzling signs that suggested she may have done it on purpose. Meanwhile, the missing women's families were left in limbo, desperate for answers. Some relatives even organized searches in Death Valley years later, scouring abandoned mines and desert expanses for any trace. But these efforts turned up nothing. After long years of false leads and frustration, most loved ones came to accept that Abelar and the others were likely never coming back. Over the year, several theories have been put forward about what happened to these missing women. The most widespread theory is that Abelar and the 4 women committed to leaving this earthly plane voluntarily after Castaneda's death. The idea of such a disturbing mass act immediately drew comparisons to infamous cult tragedies like Jonestown and Heaven's Gate. Former insiders have noted that the idea of following him into the next life was openly discussed in the group's final days. Castaneda's top female followers were fiercely loyal, and by some accounts they had long agreed not to outlive their guru. One former member even recalled that Florinda Donner, one of the missing women, even talked about using her pilot's license to fly a plane into a Hawaiian volcano. This was apparently theorized to be some sort of bizarre way to achieve spiritual enlightenment. The discovery of Parton's body in Death Valley gave credence to the idea. Perhaps the desert was chosen as a solemn location for their final exit. However, the major complication is that only Parton's remains have been found. If all five went into Death Valley together for a last act, it's curious that only one set of remains turned up. This has led some observers to question whether a synchronized event truly occurred, or if the story was more complicated. Another theory claims that Taisha Abelar and the others deliberately vanished to start new lives elsewhere. In this scenario, their disappearance was an orchestrated escape from scrutiny. There's evidence that in the weeks around Castaneda's death, his inner circle made plans for a possible getaway. They reportedly considered purchasing a large ocean-going vessel, as if preparing to literally sail off into the sunset and beyond the reach of authorities. Further, Abelar and her peers were well versed in adopting new identities. They had lived under aliases for years, and had cut ties with family, which would make disappearing easier. Financially, they weren't destitute, and Castaneda left a substantial sum of money and ongoing royalties from his book sales to this group of women. Some have speculated that this act is a clear indication that Castaneda had intended for the women to live and carry on their lives after he was gone. Investigations into the estate even hinted that some assets might have been siphoned off or hidden. It's conceivable that Abelar and her companions quietly took the money and fled the country. Some believe they could have gone to Latin America or Europe to live out their days under the radar. Given their lifelong practice of secrecy, they might have succeeded in staying hidden if they chose this path. However, until this day, no sightings of the women have ever occurred. A more sinister theory focuses on internal dynamics within the group. This hypothesis suggests that not everyone disappeared willingly or together. Notably, Patricia Parton was much younger, and some believe the others saw her as a liability when Castaneda was gone. Parton's own family members suspect that the group deliberately sent her to the desert on a false premise, intending to abandon her there. Under this theory, Parton may have been sacrificed to provide cover for the rest of the group, since finding her would imply that all members of the group perished. As of today, the disappearance of Taisha Abelar and the three other women remains unsolved. No official answers have ever emerged, and the case is as cold as it is disturbing. If Abelar were alive now, she would be in her 70s. Yet there has not been a single credible sighting or clue of her existence since 1998. Most who have examined the case lean toward the belief that all the missing women are likely deceased, whether by their own design or through some tragedy tied to their cult's collapse. When I think about Taisha Abelar's disappearance, I keep coming back to the possibility that she and some of the others actually managed to escape. Unlike other people I've profiled who may have disappeared intentionally, her life had always been defined by secrecy, discipline, and a careful crafting of new identities. She had already erased her past once, cutting ties with her family and even changing her name, so it seems plausible that she could have done it all over again. Further, the timing was perfect. Castaneda's demise created a distraction, and his estate provided money that could have fueled a fresh start. Further yet, There were financial irregularities with the estate, suggesting that she and other members may have been squirreling away resources in advance of Castaneda's passing. Abelard was intelligent, resourceful, and deeply committed to staying hidden from the outside world. It's not hard to imagine her slipping away under a new alias, perhaps abroad, where no one would ever think to look. Hey everyone, Jimmy here as usual, with a big shout out to all subscribers, YouTube members, and patrons. Also, don't forget to check out my new history video podcast, Lazy Chill History, by clicking the link in the description. Also, don't forget to leave your suggestions for cases for me to cover in the comments. Don't be shy. It doesn't have to be some ultra-obscure mystery. I've literally had people suggest I look into Bigfoot or Jack the Ripper. For more than 30 years after 1930, a lone woman would slip into a quiet Greenwich Village bar every August 6th and order 2 cocktails. She would raise 1 glass in a silent toast to her absent companion, then depart, leaving the second drink untouched. The woman was Stella Crater, and the toast was for her missing husband, Judge Joseph Force Crater, who vanished on a warm summer night in 1930 and never returned. Crater's disappearance shocked the nation and became an instant media sensation. To this day, what happened to Judge Crater remains one of America's most notorious unsolved mysteries, a true tale of a man who stepped into a taxi and was never seen again. Joseph Force Crater was no ordinary missing person. He was a prominent New York judge and attorney at the height of a successful career. Born in 1889 to Irish immigrant parents in Pennsylvania, Crater climbed the ranks of the legal world through talent and political savvy. He practiced law in Manhattan and became deeply involved with Tammany Hall, the powerful Democratic political machine that dominated New York City politics. Through his work with Tammany leader Martin Healy, Crater earned lucrative court appointments and cultivated influential connections. In one notable case in 1929, he handled a hotel foreclosure that led to a spectacular profit for a well-connected buyer, raising eyebrows about insider deal-making in Crater's circle. By 1930, Crater's loyalty and networking paid off. Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed him to fill a vacancy on the New York State Supreme Court, a prestigious judgeship, in April of that year. At just 41 years old, Crater was considered very young for the position and was seen as a rising star in New York's judiciary, backed by both political patronage and genuine ability. Justice Crater was even seen as someone who may eventually make it onto the Supreme Court one day. Despite his marriage to Stella, Judge Crater had a reputation as a man about town, and he had no problem doing a little bit of pipe-fitting work on the side. Tall, well-dressed, and sociable, he loved the nightlife of jazz-age New York. Friends nicknamed him Good Time Joe for his penchant for piano playing, dancing, and mingling with showgirls and Broadway speakeasies. He moved in both high society and more unsavory circles, rubbing elbows with politicians, business magnates, and the occasional gangster. In the summer of 1930, only months after Crater joined the state Supreme Court, trouble was brewing in New York's halls of power. The Manhattan District Attorney had launched a corruption inquiry into Tammany Hall's practice of selling judgeships to the highest bidder. Judge Crater appeared unperturbed at first, vacationing with Stella at their lakeside summer home in Maine. But on August 3rd, 1930, Crater received an urgent phone call and abruptly announced to his wife that he had to return to the city to straighten things out. He promised to be back in Maine in time for Stella's birthday on August 9th. In reality, instead of immediately tending to any official business, Crater detoured to the beach resort of Atlantic City with a young showgirl, Sally Lou Ritz, in tow. And yeah, since I can't resist a good bit of humor, it appears that the good judge was straightening certain things out, at the very least. This secret jaunt with a chorus girl would only come to light later, hinting that Crater had personal matters, or pleasures, occupying his time even as political storms gathered. Judge Crater arrived back in Manhattan on August 6, 1930, the last day he was seen alive. That morning, he went into his chambers at the courthouse and spent a couple of hours methodically sorting through his files, even reportedly destroying some documents. He had his assistant cash 2 checks for him and withdrew the modern equivalent of almost $100,000. Crater and the assistant then brought 2 locked briefcases from his office to his apartment, after which the judge dismissed his aide for the day. These actions later struck investigators as suspicious, as if Crater were tying up loose ends or stashing something important. That evening, Judge Crater continued his routine of enjoying the town. He purchased a ticket for a new Broadway comedy at the Belasco Theater, and then headed to dinner at Billy Hass's Chop House on West 45th Street. His dining companions were William Klein, a fellow lawyer and friend, and the ever-present Sally Lou Ritz, the showgirl from his Atlantic City trip. The trio ate, drank, and laughed together, with Crater reportedly in fine spirits. Sometime around 9 that evening, as the group stood outside the restaurant, Crater hailed a taxicab passing by. No one would ever definitively see Judge Joseph Crater again. At first, no alarm was raised, and when Crater failed to return to Maine for Stella's birthday, she grew annoyed, but assumed her husband's work had delayed him. Crater's colleagues in New York also thought little of his absence, believing he was still vacationing in Maine. Only after a week passed with no word did Stella begin making anxious phone calls to friends in the city, searching for any sign of him. On August 25th, the New York courts reopened for a new term and were notably 1 judge short. Crater's fellow justices, realizing he was neither in Maine nor at work, initiated quiet inquiries into his whereabouts. When these discreet efforts turned up nothing, the police were finally notified on September 3rd, 1930. The story of the missing judge hit the front pages the next day, and a frenzy of speculation ensued. A massive investigation swung into motion. Detectives discovered that Crater's personal safe deposit box had been mysteriously emptied, and those 2 briefcases he'd taken home had vanished without a trace. These leads went nowhere, however, as tips and alleged sightings of the missing judge flooded in from all over. In October 1930, a grand jury was impaneled to examine the case in exhaustive detail. 95 witnesses were called and nearly 1,000 pages of testimony collected. The inquiry delved into Crater's bank records, phone calls, and relationships, trying to piece together a puzzle with precious few pieces. Throughout, Stella Crater remained in Maine, refusing to face what she considered accusatory treatment by authorities and scandal-hungry newspapers. In January 1931, after months of hearings, the grand jury concluded its investigation with a frustrating shrug. In short, they couldn't say if he was alive or dead, let alone what caused his disappearance. In a bizarre twist, just days after the grand jury disbanded, Stella Crater made a discovery that only deepened the mystery. While cleaning out her husband's dresser back in their New York apartment, she found a secret compartment containing 4 envelopes. Inside were stacks of stocks and bonds, checks, life insurance papers, and Crater's will, all documents that had been missed in prior police searches. There was also a handwritten note from Crater himself. In it, the judge had listed various debts owed to him and included a brief, poignant message to Stella that hinted at his despair and ended with a loving goodbye. The cache suggested that Crater might have anticipated some trouble, but it yielded no concrete clues as to his fate. He was officially declared dead in absentia in 1939, allowing Stella to collect life insurance. Decades later, in 1979, the NYPD finally closed the case without resolution. From the moment the story broke in 1930, the disappearance of Judge Crater generated a whirlwind of theories. Over the years, professional investigators and amateur sleuths alike have proposed many possible explanations, each as compelling as it is unprovable. The tale has all the ingredients of a great mystery, including political intrigue, gangsters, showgirls, and a man who seemingly evaporated into thin air. One early theory was that Crater chose to vanish of his own accord. It seemed implausible that a man of his stature would abandon his career and wife without a word. Yet some pointed to the large sum of cash he withdrew and the documents he took as signs of a planned getaway. In the years after 1930, reported Crater sightings cropped up across the country and even overseas, fueling the idea that he might still be alive under an assumed identity. Tipsters claim to have seen a man resembling Crater in far-flung locales ranging from rural Canada to the South Pacific. Carnival workers, gold prospectors, and even a man in the French Foreign Legion were rumored to be the missing judge in disguise. Another theory suggested Crater met with an accidental death that was then covered up. For example, lurid rumors hinted he might have suffered a heart attack in the company of a lady of the night, and any witnesses disposed of the body rather than face scandal. After all, Crater was known for enjoying good times, so this didn't seem too unlikely. Given Judge Crater's ties to Tammany Hall and the timing of his disappearance, many have suspected that political corruption was at the heart of this mystery. Crater had been a cog in Tammany's powerful machine, and he literally owed his judgeship to their influence. He likely knew about the murky transactions involved in buying and selling public offices. In mid-1930, a state investigation was zeroing in on Tammany's judicial corruption, and Crater's mentor, Martin Healy, was under scrutiny. The theory goes that Crater might have been ready to talk, or at least that others feared he would talk. Eliminating the judge could have been a convenient way for higher-ups to protect themselves. Some even whispered of a connection to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was then New York's governor and had presidential ambitions. The logic being that if a scandal about selling judgeships blew up, it could tarnish Roosevelt on the national stage. Notably, years later, foes of Roosevelt would insinuate that FDR's allies knew more about Crater's fate, darkly suggesting that he knew where the body was. While there's no proof of any connection to Tammany Hall, this powerful and corrupt organization had benefited from extrajudicial usage of force in the past. Closely intertwined with the political angle is the possibility that organized crime figures played a role. New York's underworld and its political world were often two sides of the same coin in that era. Judge Crater was known to enjoy late nights in the city's clubs and had rubbed shoulders with some infamous characters. He was friendly with Irish gangster Jack Diamond and distraught over the 1928 slaying of his acquaintance Arnold Rothstein. Such connections have long fed the theory that Crater knew too much about the criminal underbelly of the city. Perhaps he stumbled into information that made him a liability, or perhaps someone in the mob felt the judge hadn't delivered on a promise. Another set of theories suggests that he was blackmailed by someone he was having an affair with, or a woman of whom he was a regular client. Under this theory, he had routinely been paying off large amounts of hush money to this woman in exchange for her silence. However, it's speculated that the last payment was insufficient, and she had a local gangster take him out. Personally, I don't find this narrative to be incredibly compelling, since if it's true, she permanently cut off the source of her extortion. After all, he was a politically well-connected judge, and he would have further money or influence to extort in the future. Simply put, I think this is likely just a lurid theory that was drummed up to sell newspapers back in the day. For decades, the mystery of Judge Crater remained stubbornly unsolved until a stunning potential clue emerged 75 years later. In August 2005, New York authorities announced they had obtained new evidence in the cold case. A handwritten letter left by a 91-year-old widow named Stella Ferrucci Good. This woman had been the wife of a detective, and in a letter opened after she had perished, she revealed an explosive story her husband had allegedly told her. According to Ferrucci Good's letter, Judge Crater had indeed been slain back in 1930, not by mobsters or jilted lovers, but by two men, one of them who wore a badge. The letter named a New York City police officer, Charles Burns, and his brother Frank, who happened to be a cab driver. On the night of August 6, 1930, the story went, the Burns brothers somehow intercepted Crater. They eliminated the judge and then buried his body under the Coney Island boardwalk in Brooklyn. Incredibly, the letter also tied Charles Burns to other violence of the era. Investigators in 2005 were initially intrigued, and they noted the area mentioned. West 8th Street on Coney Island, now the site of the New York Aquarium, had indeed been excavated during construction in the 1950s. And actually, let me just jump in here for a second, since as I was doing the editing on this video, I realized something. Coney Island isn't an actual island anymore, and hasn't been one for well over a century when an engineering project connected it to Brooklyn. Anyway, if a skeleton had been found then, it was never reported. Police records showed no such discovery, and a preliminary check of municipal works didn't turn up any bones either. This late-breaking confession left more questions than answers. No one could say if the detective's tale was true, or if it was just a fanciful story that he told to his wife. Since Stella had already passed away by the time the letter was opened, there was no opportunity to question her about the contents of the letter. Further yet, the evidence is hearsay from a person who isn't even alive, giving evidence about a supposed conversation with another person who also isn't alive. This is, of course, extremely problematic, as aside from confirming that her husband was indeed a police officer, nothing else could be known for certain. Stella herself could have simply been an avid follower of the case with a bit of a sick sense of humor, looking to insert herself into the investigation from beyond the grave. And if that was her intent, well then she definitely succeeded. At any rate, no physical evidence was recovered to substantiate the claim, and skeptics pointed out inconsistencies. In the years following Crater's disappearance, his name became a punchline and a piece of Americana, even as his wife quietly kept her vow to never forget him. The very phrase, "to pull a crater," entered the lexicon as slang for vanishing without a trace. And from my research, it looks as though this phrase would have essentially been used in the same way we use the phrase ghosting today. Whatever the case, Justice Crater's disappearance likely remains such a popular unsolved mystery because there are so many possibilities as to what happened. Further, some of these possibilities credibly intersect with big names in both New York history and American history. Imagine a mother with nearly infinite resources in a state of extreme grief. Her beloved son, the heir to a vast fortune and an ancient title, has vanished at sea, presumed dead for over a decade. But she refuses to believe it, and she spends years and a small fortune placing ads in newspapers across the globe, clinging to the desperate hope that he survived. Then, one day, a letter from a lawyer arrives from the Australian outback, and a man has come forward saying he's her long-lost son. He's coarse, unrefined, and enormously obese, bearing little resemblance to the slender, French-speaking aristocrat who disappeared. But he claims to be her son, and against all odds, she believes him. This isn't the plot of Netflix's latest Victorian period piece, at least not yet, but rather the true story of the Tichborne case. To understand the sheer audacity of the claim, we first have to understand the man whose identity was more than likely stolen. Sir Roger Charles Tichborne was the heir to one of England's great fortunes, as well as sprawling estates in Hampshire and elsewhere. Born in Paris in 1829 and raised by his French mother, Henriette, Roger grew up speaking English with a noticeable French accent. He wasn't a storybook prince. He was described as a slender, spoiled, and ill-educated young man, fond of heavy drinking and generally profane behavior. To give a sense of how much of a rebel this guy was, he was a 19th century high nobleman with a bunch of tattoos, a fact that shocked the sensibilities of contemporaries. As a young man, he fell deeply in love with his first cousin, Catherine Doughty, but the family opposed the match for somewhat obvious reasons. Heartbroken, Roger resigned his army commission, and he embarked on a grand tour of South America in 1853 to put some distance between himself and Catherine. In April 1854, the 25-year-old boarded a ship called the Bella in Rio de Janeiro. The ship and its passengers were never seen again. When wreckage was found off the Brazilian coast, Roger Tichborne was presumed dead. Running parallel to the life of the aristocratic heir was that of a man from the other end of the social spectrum. Arthur Orton was born in 1834 in Wapping, a rough and tumble district of London's docks, the son of a butcher who supplied ship's stores. His world couldn't have been more different from the Tichborne estates. After leaving school early, Orton went to sea, deserted his ship in Chile, and lived there for over a year, where he was befriended by a Chilean family. During his time with the family, he took on the name Tom Castro, an identity swap that would foreshadow what would happen next. After a brief return to London, he sailed for Australia in 1852. There, his life was a gritty colonial existence of a butcher, mail runner, and station hand, with persistent rumors of horse theft and other crimes shadowing his movements. By the mid-1860s, he was living in the remote Australian town of Wagga Wagga as a butcher named Thomas Castro, married to an illiterate woman and mired in debt. While seemingly random, Orton's life experiences inadvertently provided the perfect raw material for an incredible deception. The event that brought these two disparate worlds crashing together was a mother's refusal to give up hope. Lady Tichborne never accepted Roger's death. She was spurred on by rumors of shipwreck survivors in Australia and the pronouncements of a clairvoyant. Due to this, she began a relentless campaign of newspaper advertisements, offering a quote-unquote handsome reward for any information about her son. And if there was anyone who was able to pay out a big fat reward, it was Lady Tichborne. In 1865, a lawyer in Wagga Wagga, William Gibbs, saw the ad and connected it to his bankrupt client, Tom Castro. He encouraged Castro to make the claim, and soon, letters were on their way to England. From then on, this man of many names would often be known as the Tichborne claimant, or simply the claimant for short. The correspondence was riddled with errors. For instance, the claimant called his mother Hannah Francis and made mistakes about the family properties. But Lady Tichborne was undeterred. She sent money for his passage, and in January 1867, they met in Paris. Despite him speaking no French whatsoever, she immediately and unequivocally recognized the claimant as her son. Notably, the uncanny resemblance between the two men is one of the most mysterious aspects of this case, and long fueled the rumor that the claimant was perhaps an illegitimate child of the family. She granted him an income of £1,000 a year, giving his audacious claim the one thing it desperately needed: legitimacy. And as a quick aside, this is the equivalent of almost £200,000 per year at present in an allowance alone. He was also given residence in Tichborne Park, a sprawling country estate where he allegedly grew up. The claimant was given full access to all the luxuries of an estate owner during the time period. Basically, think Downton Abbey, with a full array of servants. The income he was granted was, in essence, play money, so to speak, as he had no real expenses to speak of, with everything being covered by his alleged mother. Right from the very beginning, many people were extremely skeptical about the claimant. Skeptics felt that Lady Tichborne's grief didn't just lead her to find her son, it effectively recreated him, transforming a provincial con man into a national celebrity. The case exploded into a Victorian media sensation, captivating the public for the better part of a decade. Newspapers provided daily coverage, and the story became a form of national entertainment. The affair cleaved society in two, primarily along class lines: the establishment, the aristocracy, the government, and the legal profession was almost universally against the claimant. But the working classes rallied to his side, seeing him as a popular hero, a rough-hewn colonial underdog doing battle with a corrupt and snobbish elite. For them, it was less about belief in the fact that the claimant was actually Sir Roger. The fact that he was so obviously not Sir Roger was what brought so much joy to many of them. They were simply happy to see buffoonish aristocrats mauling over the presence of the claimant living in their midst, being forced to treat him as their equal. Well, that was at least while Lady Tichborne was alive and providing him protection. When she passed away, the whole case would heat up big time. After Lady Tichborne died in 1868, the claimant's main source of funding vanished. In a stroke of genius, his supporters launched an innovative crowdfunding scheme known as Tichborne Bonds. These bonds were sold to the public, guaranteeing a payout of £100 if the claimant won his inheritance. The scheme was a wild success, raising an astonishing £40,000 and demonstrating the incredible depth of his popular support. To put it in context, this is well over £6 million today. People weren't just following a story, they were literally investing in a man's identity, turning his claim into a speculative asset on the stock market of public opinion. Unfortunately for early investors, this was basically the 19th century version of a cryptocurrency rug pull. I'm sure the 19th century version of CoffeeZilla was all over him for this. The first great legal battle began in May 1871. The civil trial, ostensibly an action to eject him as a tenant from Tichborne Park, was in reality a trial of identity. The claimant's case rested almost entirely on personal recognition. Over 100 witnesses, former soldiers, servants, and associates, swore that he was Roger Tichborne. He seemed to recall intimate details from Roger's past, like the name of a pet dog, which lent his story an air of credibility. Further, the claimant seemed fairly well versed in Catholic tradition, and while Sir Roger perhaps wasn't the most devout Catholic, he absolutely grew up immersed in the tradition. This was later explained by the fact that the claimant's wife was indeed Catholic, and that he had apparently converted while in Australia. But his case crumbled during 22 grueling days of cross-examination. Under the piercing questions of the family's lawyer, his ignorance was laid bare. He couldn't speak or understand a word of French, Sir Roger's childhood language, which the real man spoke at a native level. In fact, the real Roger was said to have spoken French much more proficiently than he did English. Notably, the claimant also knew nothing about Stonyhurst, the elite school Roger had attended, and where he spent many of his formative years. He was also unable to properly identify his friends from this time. a fact that was considered to be virtually inconceivable for someone of his class. These connections made at these elite private schools didn't simply vanish, and the real Sir Roger had maintained close ties to his old boys network up until he disappeared. Simply put, this wasn't just a case of not remembering some kids he went to school with. This was more akin to not remembering members of your lifelong social circle. He couldn't even recognize his own mother's handwriting, and had no memory of a sealed package Roger had left with a servant before his fateful voyage. Further, despite being a 19th century nobleman, Roger had tattoos, while the claimant didn't, and trust me, there was no tattoo removal available at the time. A big part of the case against the claimant was how morbidly obese the claimant was. Roger was known to be slender, while the claimant was 400 pounds, a weight almost unheard of in this era. Notably, extensive weight was placed on this fact, despite this being objectively one of the least fishy things about his case. The real Roger Tichborne could indeed have become old and obese, especially given his excessive lifestyle and extreme indulgence in food and drink. Ultimately, given the weight of the evidence against him, the claimant was evicted from Tichborne Park, but the worst for him was yet to come. The second trial, a criminal matter which began in April 1873, was even more epic, lasting 188 days and becoming one of the longest in English history. The goal now wasn't just to disprove the Tichborne identity, but to affirmatively prove the Orton identity. The prosecution brought forward 215 witnesses. People from Wapping identified the claimant as their old neighbor, whom some identified as Arthur Orton. Evidence emerged that upon his arrival in England, the claimant had made a suspicious trip to Wapping to ask about the status of the Orton family. Handwriting experts also testified that his script matched Orton's, not Tichborne's, though I have to question the legitimacy of such expert testimony. Handwriting analysis isn't an exact science even today, and I strongly suspect the 19th century version of it was even more questionable. The defense staked its hopes on a dramatic surprise witness, a Danish sailor who claimed to have been on the ship that rescued the Bella's survivors. But the prosecution quickly exposed this Danish sailor as a recently released convict who had previous convictions for perjury, and his testimony backfired catastrophically. After 188 days of testimony, the jury took less than half an hour to find the claimant guilty. They declared he was not Roger Tichborne, he was Arthur Orton, and sentenced him to 14 years of hard labor for perjury. Interestingly, the last convicts were shipped off to Australia in the 1860s, so Arthur just missed the cutoff for an all-expenses-paid cruise back to his adopted homeland. Also, just as a quick aside, this may have been the worst jury to serve on in history, as the jurors were paid the equivalent of about £10 per day in present-day currency. After serving 10 years, the man the law now called Arthur Orton was released from prison in 1884. The popular movement that had once hailed him as a hero had fizzled out. He tried to cash in on his fame on the music hall circuit, regaling people with the stories of his time as Sir Roger, but interest had waned significantly while he was locked up. In 1895, living in poverty, he accepted money from a newspaper to publish a confession that he was indeed Arthur Orton, only to retract it almost immediately. He died destitute on April 1st, 1898. In a final baffling twist, the Tichborne family, who had spent a fortune to expose him as a fraud, either provided or explicitly allowed a plate to be placed on his coffin bearing a certain name. That plate bore the name Sir Roger Charles Doty Tichborne, providing proof in the eyes of his sympathizers that the claimant may not have been Arthur Orton after all.